everyone, welcome back to class. I'm going to start with the good news today. The good news is that today's lesson is hopefully going to look super familiar because we're basically going to repeat everything that we did on the demand side and just do it on the supply side. So hopefully, if you understood the last couple of classes, today will make a whole lot of sense and it won't be too brain intensive. So we're going to keep going on chapter 4. This is going to be part 3. Again, I'm going through chapter 4 kind of slowly just because it's so kind of foundational to economics. I don't want you to miss any component of this. So, for your notes, we are in chapter 4, and today is part 3, where we're going to talk about supply. Okay, first of all, I'm going to start with just some definitions. Again, these definitions should look very familiar based on what you saw for the demand side. So the first definition is the law of supply. And the law of supply says, all other things equal, so if we assume ceteris paribus, that when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied of the good rises, and then it also works backwards. So when the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied falls. Okay, so for your notes, the law of supply is all other things equal, which is ceteris paribus, when the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied of the good rises. And then again, it also works backwards. So when the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied of the good falls. Okay. Note that the big difference here relative to the law of demand is the relationship between price and quantity. So if you look back in your notes, the law of demand says that anytime you move the price of a good, the quantity demanded of the good moves in the opposite direction. So if price rises, quantity demanded falls. Now, the price and quantity are going to move in the same direction under the supply when we're looking at the supply side. So according to the law of supply, if you hold everything in the world still, you don't let anything move other than the price, then when the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up, and then when the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. Okay, similar to how we had a definition for quantity demanded, we're going to have a definition for quantity supplied. Okay, what is quantity supplied? Quantity supplied is the amount of a good that sellers are both willing and able to supply. So again, this is very kind of consistent with quantity demanded. The idea is if I'm producing a good, then the number of units that I supply in the market is based on two things. It's based on, number one, my willingness to sell the good and my ability to sell the good. So if I'm willing to sell a good but I'm not able to, then I'm not going to supply anything. Similarly, if I'm able but I'm not willing to supply a good, then I'm not going to be supplying anything. So the idea is how many goods are actually offered for sale depends on the number of goods that sellers intuitively both are able to sell and want to sell. Okay, so for your notes, the quantity supplied is defined as the amount of a good sellers are willing and able to sell. So willing is important and able is important. Okay, so we got two definitions. Now let's draw the supply curve. So again, according to the law of supply, if you take everything in the world and you just kind of make it hold still, which is ceteris paribus, then when you change the price of a good, the number of units or the quantity of the good that sellers are willing to supply or sell is going to move in the same direction as the movement in the price. So the supply curve is going to have a positive slope. So again, we're always going to plot price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. And now we're going to have a curve that has a positive slope. And the reason for this is because this curve, again, is just a series of price and quantity coordinates. So each dot along this curve says if the price was this much, this is the number of units sellers would be willing and able to sell. If the price was this much, this is the number of units. This is then if we were sitting at this point, then that would tell us that at this price, this many units would be consistent with the quantity that sellers would be willing and able to sell. Okay, so again, this is kind of intuitive because suppose you open a bakery and you're trying to sell your baked products. If baked products aren't being sold at a very high price, so maybe if the going price for a cake is like $0, well then why would you want to sell any cakes, because you're not going to make any money. But if the price of cakes is like $50 per cake, then you're going to want to sell a whole bunch of cakes. Like you're really going to want to like get into this industry and sell a whole bunch because the price point for the good is really high. And so the positive slope simply tells us that if you look at a particular market and the price point goes up, then the quantity that sellers are willing and able to sell or supply is also going to go up. Similarly, if you're in a market and the price just tanks for a given good, then sellers aren't really going to want to sell that good so much, so they're going to pull back their quantity supply. Okay, so that's what the picture looks like. So another thing that's similar to the demand is we can derive supply curves for the market based on individual sellers' supply curves. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit since you've seen some of this. So a market supply curve is going to be the sum of the put the O's next to the F, of the supplies of all sellers for a particular good or service. So again, each market is indexed by a particular good or a particular service. Okay, to derive a market supply, we are going to do the same thing that we did on the demand side. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at each seller's individual price and quantity schedule for what they'd be willing to sell. And then we're going to horizontally sum those supplies. And then that will give us the market quantity supply. So to derive the market supply curve, we're going to sum individual sellers' supply curves horizontally. Okay, the horizontal component is important. Again, just think about how we did this in the demand world. So in the demand world, we had a downward sloping demand, and we had different people who were buying a product. What we did to figure out the market demand is we pegged ourselves at a particular price. So maybe we pegged ourselves at this price. Okay, well, maybe for this first buyer, at that price point, he would be willing to purchase 2 units. So he would have kind of horizontal leg that's 2 units long. maybe for this other buyer at this particular price that we're looking at, he'd be willing to buy 3 units. So we have another leg that's 3 units long. Well, what that means is that in the market, when we horizontally sum the demand curves, we go over 2 units for the first guy. We go over 3 units for the second guy. This is the horizontal summation. And so in the market, at this given price point, now this is the number of units that are demanded. And so we're going to have a market demand curve that's just shifted out more and more, the more people you have in the market and the more units they demand. Okay, exactly the same intuition for the supply. So I'm going to give you some specific numbers so you can have a concrete example to hold on to. And we'll think about the market for ice cream cones. And let's suppose we have 2 people who are selling ice cream cones, Ben and Jerry. So I'm going to write the schedule of the numbers first, and then we'll think about how this fits in with the plot. So in the first column of the table, we're going to have the price of a ice cream cone. And in the second column, we're going to have supplier number 1, which is Ben. In the second column, we're going to have supplier number 2, which is Jerry. And then we'll eventually get to the market. Okay, so the various prices that we might look at are nothing, 50 cents, $1, $1.50, $2, $2.50, and we'll make $3 the last price point. And then let's say for Ben, okay, he's this guy that's thinking about selling ice cream cones. If he looks at the market for ice cream cones and he's kind of thinking about, do I want to enter this market and start supplying ice cream cones? Well, if all the cones are being sold for 0, then how many is he going to want to supply? For this guy, it's none. Like, if he's not going to make any money by selling these things, he's not going to be willing to supply any. Similarly, for this guy, maybe if he sees that the price of each ice cream cone is only 50 cents, every time he sold one, he'd only bring in a revenue of 50 cents. He's not willing to supply any. Maybe if the price of ice cream cone is $1, then he's like, okay, I'd be willing to sell 1. If the price is $1.50, okay, I'm making a little bit more, I'll supply a little bit more. And let's just keep on going with this pattern. And so what this would tell you is that for Ben, if ice cream cones are being sold at like $3 a pop, like that's a pretty good amount of money for an ice cream cone, so he'd be willing to supply 5 ice cream cones. Okay, so what we can do is we can take these price and quantity coordinates and we can plot Ben's individual supply curve. Okay, so for Ben, if the price is 0, his quantity supplied is going to be 0, so he's going to have 1 coordinate there. If the price is 50 cents, so 0.50, he's still going to be not supplying any, so quantity is still going to be 0. If the price goes up to $1, he'd be willing to sell 1. So he's going to have a coordinate at 1, 1. If the price is $1.50, he'd be willing to sell 2. So we're going to go up to $1.50 over 2. The price is $2. He would be willing to sell 3. We're going to have another coordinate there. If the price is $2.50, he'd be willing to sell 4. If the price is $3, he'd be willing to sell 5. So if you connect the dots, this is the supply curve. Sorry, it needs to hit at 50 cents. This is the supply curve for Ben. Okay, Jerry's an entirely different person, so he might have a different willingness to supply given different price points. So let's just say that for Ben, if the price in the market is $0 for ice cream cones, he's not willing to supply any. If it's 50 cents, he's not willing to supply any. Let's say if it's $1, he's not willing to supply any. If the price in the market for ice cream cones is $1.50, okay, like that's maybe a decent price point for him. So maybe at that price point he'd be willing to supply 2. If it's $2, then he's going to be making more money, and so he'd be willing to supply 4. And then let's just keep going with this same pattern, and he'll go up by 2. Okay, again, notice that this follows the law of supply. So the law of supply says if you hold everything else in the world constant, but you just increase the price of a good, what happens? The quantity that's supplied increases. So as these numbers get bigger, these numbers get bigger. As these numbers get smaller, these numbers get smaller. Okay, we can take Jerry's price and quantity coordinates, and we can plot his quantity supplied. So for Jerry, if the price is 0, he's not willing to supply any. If the price is 50 cents, he's not willing to supply any. If the price is 1, he's not willing to supply any. If the price is $1.50, okay, he'll supply 2. So at 1.5, we'll go over 2 units, and there will be a coordinate right there. If the price is $2, then he would be willing to supply 4. So we're going to have another coordinate at 2, 4. If the price is $2.50, he would be willing to supply 6. Hopefully your notes are a little bit more to scale than mine, but you get the idea. And then if the price were a whole $3, so we got $3 here, then he would be willing to supply 8. So at 3, 8, we're going to have another dot. So if you connect these dots, okay, that gives us Jerry's supply curve. Okay, well, what about the market? The market, again, is just the horizontal summation of the quantities supplied at each price point. So if the price in the market is 0, well, producer number 1 supplies 0, producer number 2 supplies 0, so in the market, there's 0 that are supplied. If the price point in the market is 50 cents, neither producer makes anything, so there's 0 that are supplied. If the price is $1, producer number 1 makes and supplies 1. The other producer doesn't supply any, so in the entire market, which consists of these 2 people, there's only 1 unit that's supplied. At a price of $1.50, supplier number 1 offers 2 on the market, supplier number 2 offers 2 on the market, so in total, there are 4 units that are supplied. We can just keep going on down the table. So if we're adding these numbers, we're going to get 7, 10, and 13. Okay, so what do we do with this? We now have a whole new set of coordinates where we have the price in the market and then the market quantity supplied. Okay, note that the market quantity supplied is just the horizontal sum of these 2 guys' supply curves. So, I'm going to put the market supply over here. In your own notes, you can put it on the right if you have room, but I'm going to put it over here for space. So, in the market, what we've got going on is we have price against quantity again. And let's start with, okay, so we've got 50 cents, $1, $1.50, 2, $2.53. Let's just start at $3. At $3 in the market, there are 13 units that are supplied. Okay, again, this is consistent with horizontally summing the individual supply curves. Because for this guy, at a price of $3, he went over 5. For this guy, at a price of $3, he went over 8. So in the market, what do? You go over 5, you go over another 8. That gets you to a dot right there that's at 13, which again matches up with this. Okay, what about a price of $2.50? Well, at a price of $2.50, this guy went over 4 units. This guy went over 6 units. So what do we do in the market? We horizontally sum. So we go over 4. Then we go over 6. That gives us a new dot at 10. And then we just keep on doing this for every single price point, and we're going to get a new market supply where each of these coordinates along the market supply matches up with the coordinate that goes with this price and this quantity, this price and this quantity, all the way down to this price and this quantity. Okay, so again, hopefully this isn't rocket science. It's the same thing we did on the demand side, except now we have an upward sloping supply curve instead of a downward sloping demand curve. Okay, so this is the first thing. The second thing we're going to think about is things that would cause the location of the supply curve to shift right or shift left. So we did this for the demand. Now we're just going to do it for the supply. Okay, so flip the page here. Okay, first thing to note is something you already hopefully are aware of. The thing to note is that changes in supply are different than changes in quantity supplied. So changes or shifts in supply are different than changes in quantity supplied. Okay, changes in supply mean that the whole supply curve moves location, so it shifts to the right or to the left. Changes in quantity supplied mean we're not changing the supply, we're just changing the quantity coordinate that we're looking at. So the supply curve is going to stay fixed in a given location, and we're just going to slide up and down the curve so that we can see what the price would be at different quantities that we're considering. Okay, first thing, an increase in supply. What is it? So an increase in supply is going to be any change that increases the quantity supplied at every price. So it's going to be any change that increases the quantity supplied at every price. Okay, so just think about what this would look like. So if you have a supply curve, then what would an increase in supply be? It would say that at any price that you might look at, so maybe at this price, there would be an increase in the quantity supplied. So if this is the price we're looking at, and this is the original quantity supplied, well now for that given price that we've pegged ourselves at, an increase in supply would mean that the quantity supply would have to shift right, or we'd have to move right. And this is going to be true for any price that we're looking at. So if this is the original quantity supplied, then it's going to have to be higher. So a rightward shift in the supply curve is going to be consistent with an increase in supply. Okay, so for your notes, just note that the supply curve shifts right. This curve shifts right. Okay, decrease in supply is just the opposite. So a decrease in supply is going to be any change that decreases the quantity supplied at every price. Okay, so again, just visually think about how this would work. If you've got a supply curve like that, a decrease in supply would say no matter which price you look at, so maybe you look at this price, if this is the original quantity supplied, a decrease in the supply would mean that quantity would have to go down. So maybe we'd have a coordinate there. And if we wanted to look at this price. Well, if this was the original quantity supplied, it has to go down. So this would coincide with the supply curve shifting left. So supply curve shifts left. Okay, again, just emphasize in your own mind that for both supply and demand, when you're changing the supply or the demand, you're shifting the curve horizontally, like you're going right and left, because when you do the summation, you're doing it right and left. So it's thinking about pegging yourself at a given price, and then at that given price level going increasing or decreasing. So do not think about this as taking the curve and shifting it up. That's not quite what we're doing here. We're actually shifting it left instead of up or down. Okay, so the next part of this is if that is the definition of an increase or decrease in supply, then what are examples of things that would actually cause the supply curve to shift left or shift right? So this list is going to be a little bit shorter than the list for the demand curve, which is good. Less memorization for you. Actually, first, just for your notes, I think I drew this picture for you for demands. I want to make sure you have it for supply. Okay, so what we've got here is an original supply curve. A increase in supply would look like shifting the supply curve right. So this would be a supply that has increased. A decrease in supply would mean the whole supply curve shifts to the left. So this would be a supply that has decreased. Okay, so again, remember, you're moving it left and right. You're not moving it up and down. Okay, so now what are things that might cause one of these two movements to happen? Okay, so we're going to again make a bucket list here. So these are examples of things that can shift the supply curve. Okay, example number 1 is input prices. Okay, let me kind of explain what an input is. So an input is any kind of ingredient that you need to make the good that you're supplying. So for example, if we're thinking about the market for ice cream cones, well, the sellers, Ben and Jerry, they need certain things to make their ice cream. Those are the inputs. So inputs to ice cream might be sugar and milk. They might also be equipment to make the ice cream. It might also be people who work in the factory. So all those things are the necessary ingredients that you need to produce the good. These are the inputs. So the idea is if the priciness of the input changes, then that's going to cause the whole market supply curve to get up and move to the left or right, which is another way of saying that if the price of the market holds steady at some price point, then once this happens, suppliers are going to be willing to supply a different number of units at that given price point because the inputs have either become more expensive or cheaper. Okay, so let me give you kind of more specifics here. So the specifics are going to be that supply is negatively related to input prices. Okay, what does this mean? This simply means, for example, that higher input prices cause a decrease in the supply. And you can also think about this in reverse, and it works too. So similarly, cheaper input prices will cause an increase in the supply. Okay, this should be pretty intuitive. So let's just think about ice cream cones. And we've got Ben and Jerry selling their ice cream cones. And suppose that currently ice cream cones are being sold at $2 a piece. And suppose, in total, let's see, what were they producing at $2 a piece? They're making 4 ice cream cones in total, supplying 4 ice cream cones. Okay, if there's an input price change, and that would be like, suppose for some reason sugar just becomes really, really expensive. Well, if I'm Ben and Jerry, I know that every time I sell an ice cream cone, I'm getting $2 from my customer. But if sugar suddenly becomes really, really expensive, then that means my cost to produce the ice cream cones, it's like a lot more than what it used to be. So now these $2 I'm getting from the customer, they're not quite they don't mean as much to me anymore because it took more money for me to like actually produce the good. So if the price didn't change, if it stayed at $2, if sugar becomes expensive, then what's going to happen is that each, or at least one of the suppliers, most of the suppliers, probably all the suppliers are going to supply fewer units, so quantity supplied is going to go down. And so the whole supply curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, think about what would happen if suddenly inputs become super cheap. Well, if I'm Ben and Jerry and I'm supplying ice cream cones, and currently each cone is selling for $2 a piece, and then for some reason Publix just has like a surplus of sugar and they just start giving it away for free, that's great news for me as a supplier because every time I sell a cone, I get $2. But now cones are like really, really cheap for me to make. So like $2 is like really good because my costs are so low. So if the input prices fall, then the quantity supplied is going to go up for that given price point in the market. Okay, so first thing that can cause the location of the supply curve to shift left or right is a change in the input prices. Okay, second thing that might cause a change in the supply, or would cause a change in the supply, is technology. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Okay, technology is just kind of like the tech that is available to you in the production process. So suppose we're thinking about ice cream cones. Back in the good old days, they used to just like put the milk and the sugar and everything together in an ice cream maker and they would manually churn it. So it took a lot of effort to supply the ice cream. But at some point, technology kind of improved, and now you don't have to have a person like actually cranking the ice cream maker. You can just like put the ingredients in a machine and it just spits it out, so it's really easy to do it. So if that's the case, then what usually happens is it becomes just like more easy and efficient to make the good. And so when the price point stays the same in the market, if there's a technology improvement at that given price point, you're going to be willing and able to supply more. So for your notes, what you need to know is that advances in technology cause an increase in supply. So technology increases lead to rightward shifts in the supply curve. Okay, thing number 3 that might cause the supply curve to shift is expectations about the future. So this was another thing that caused the demand curve to shift, so it's also going to cause supply to shift. So expectations about the future. Okay, the idea is if I am producing some kind of good and I kind of look into or anticipate something's going to happen down the road, then based on what I anticipate to happen, that's either going to cause me to like rein in my production or to like ramp up production and start producing more. So for example, if I'm a producer and I expect higher prices, then what is that going to cause me to do? That is going to cause me to lower my production, so it will lead to a decrease in supply. Okay, mentally disengage this for a minute. So I'm Ben and Jerry, I'm making ice cream cones, I'm selling each ice cream cone at $2 a piece, and then suppose I just kind of expect that tomorrow something's going to happen and there's going to be an increase in the price of ice cream cones. So maybe I expect that tomorrow the market price is going to go up from $2 to like $10 per ice cream cone. Then what do? You say, whoa, in the future, like, I'm going to be making lots of money because the prices are going to go up. So let me just like slow down my production now and shift all my resources to the future so I'm like kind of saving my energy kind of and like using it to make the good when the price point is really high. And it also works in reverse. So if I anticipate as a supplier that prices are going to tank tomorrow, then what do? Well, I ramp up my production today because tomorrow I'm not going to be making much money off of this thing. So I'm going to increase my supply today if I anticipate a reduction in the price tomorrow. Okay. The last thing, and then we'll be done with this part of the chapter, is the number of sellers will affect the location of the supply curve. Okay, so again, this is intuitive, hopefully. So the idea is that in the market we have individual suppliers, and when you sum the quantity supplied across the individuals, that gives you the market, drew the demand curve there, that gives you the market supply. This is the market, this is individual 1, this is individual 2. Okay, what makes sense then is if we somehow add an extra individual here, so we just like find an extra person, then that affects the market because now we need to go over this many units, this many units, and this many units, and the market would go over this many, this many, this many, and we get the whole curve shifting right. Similarly, if something happens and people start dropping off and the number of sellers fall, well now we've only got one person in the market, so we only go over once, and then we draw the line, and so relative to the original supply curve, this would be a decrease in demand. Okay, so again, hopefully this is somewhat easy since you've seen the demand side of this. So if anything is still unclear, let me know during the next 10 minutes. If it's all clear, then go stretch and get a drink of water. And after that, we'll meet back and I'll give you the exercise. Okay, your task for today is consider the following scenario. Suppose, stand over here, we have two individuals. We have Grandma Betty and Grandma Sue, and they're both willing and able to sell cookies. Suppose that the number of cookies that they would be willing and able to supply are these numbers at these given price points. So if the going price of a cookie is free, Grandma Betty would be willing and able to supply 1. Grandma Sue would be willing and able to supply 3. Going down the table, if the price of each cookie was $3, Grandma Betty would supply 10. Grandma Sue would supply 6. Okay, what we're going to do is we're basically going to do the same kind of exercise that we did for the demand side, but just think about it in terms of the supply side. So your first task, you do not need to turn this part in, but it's going to help you for the rest of it, is on your own, just draw the market supply curve for cookies. So what you need to do to draw the market supply curve is you basically need to have an extra column here where you figure out the market quantity supplied given the price points, and then plot the price quantity coordinates for the market, and then that will give you a supply curve for the entire market. Okay, this is just kind of like preliminary work that you need to know how to do in order to proceed. Okay, the first question that you have to turn in is, at a price of $2, respond with the correct quantity supplied of cookies in the market. So in other words, if the going price for cookies is $2 a piece, then in the overall market, how many cookies would be supplied? Okay, questions 2, 3, and 4, I want you to think about the supply curve and then consider if this thing happened, then would the supply curve shift to the left? Would it shift to the right? Would the supply curve stay in the same location and we would just slide up, slide right or left along the curve? So, for 2, for example, think about what would happen to or along the supply curve if the price of sugar, which is needed to make cookies, goes down. So if that happens, would the supply curve shift left? Would it shift right? Would we slide left along the supply curve? Would we slide right along the supply curve? So answer what would happen. For the next one, respond with what would happen to the supply curve if the grandmas just started giving away their cookies for free. So they decide, like, we just like baking for people, here's free cookies, we're not going to sell them, we're just going to give them away for free. Then what would happen to the supply curve? And then the last scenario is what would happen to the supply curve if one of the grandmas quit baking. So if she just shut down shop, said I'm not baking anymore, then would the whole market supply curve shift left? Would it shift right? Would it stay in the same spot? And then you'd slide left along the curve or slide right along the curve. Friendly kind of hint, it's going to be really critical that you know how to do these types of problems for the exams. So make sure it's really solid in your mind what causes shifts and slides along the supply curve and the demand curve. Once you're done with that, you're free. And if any of this isn't making sense, reach out during the week and I'll try to help clarify things. So enjoy the rest of your day.